Our artist talk on this beautiful day in Exeter. Thank you for coming inside instead of staying outside, but I'm going to talk quickly, and I think you all were just talking, but Amanda and I got together and planned this show about 1.5 years ago. She came up with the title Patina Gold, which I thought was brilliant, and we're so happy to have people see our work and come to our artist talk. So I'm focusing on my artist talk. I think many of you know me already, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But new people, you can read more about my influences on my website. But I'm focusing today on some people, engineers that came to visit me at the studio that told me a lot about the parts they had made that they recognized in my work. So. Just a little background for those of you new to my work. I moved to New Hampshire in 1986 from Louisiana, and before that, Indiana. I created my first industrial quilt, as I called them, in 1990. The idea came from a 2-year sabbatical of sorts, where my husband and I researched the Industrial Revolution and the textile mill history here in New England. We took tours of the Lowell Mill Canal tour there, also the Amoskeag Mill Museum tours. We researched the mill girls who came from the farms to work in the mills. It was fascinating to learn about them, and their lives changed so dramatically, both socially and economically, when they made that change from the farm to the factory and from being hand work craftspeople to the machines. And so I began to think differently about my textile art and my fabric quilts. I'm interested in the person behind the machine, the craftsperson, and how they may contribute to innovation and objects of value. So I began to think, how can I make a modern quilt that references history and appears as if it was made in a factory, but aesthetically highlights the handwork of the craftsperson? In this talk, I'm going to talk about how I salvaged computer parts in a New Hampshire salvage yard in the 1990s. So I had been making my industrial quilts. I was at the salvage yard for another reason, and I accidentally discovered all these parts that were being thrown away and in these bins. And they were computer parts, circuit boards, and microchips from the new technology industry here in New Hampshire at that time, which was really booming. I thought the parts were beautiful. I was so curious about them and how they were made and invented. There were companies up here at that time, especially in the 80s and 90s. As you know, there was a company called Cabletron Systems. It started around 1983 and it closed in 2001. They were a $1 billion company at one time. They employed the highest number of workers at that time, 4,000 in their factories in Rochester, New Hampshire. They were hiring a lot of young people actually to work in there. There was a microchip company in the Amoskeag mills that were doing some cutting edge microchips, and some of those were discarded. So I got a lot of cast off parts, which these companies, I learned later, do throw a lot of their parts away. There was another company that was known for the invention of bookbinding on their circuit boards that made them flexible and they could make them longer. And the reason I know that is because there was an engineer, well, I guess he's called an engineer, but he's a circuit board genius, basically, that made circuit boards from the time he was 17. And he gave me a ton of information. What happened was, he was at the Courier Museum, saw my piece there that incorporated some parts that he recognized that he had made. And there was another engineer there that also recognized the parts, and they started talking to each other. And I loved hearing about this. And then this Bob Nelson went and looked up my website, and there he was able to get in touch with me, and he wanted to come and visit my studio. And I was thrilled because I had always wanted to know more about these parts. So we talked to each other for over 3 hours in my studio, and we went through everything, and I'll show you some of these parts and what they were used for. Some of the companies back then, I don't know if some of you were around at the time. His first company he worked at was called Hadco. Then there was Rosemont, Sanders, Lockheed, I think bought Sanders.
Yes.
Yes, Teledyne, Honeywell, and now Northrop Grumman. So it's been an ever evolving, innovative, flexible circuit board companies and people. And they were responsible for the bookbinder construction, which was unique to here. Let's see. So he also recognized some parts that were made for Raytheon. And he could tell that because there's number codings on some of the parts. So he knew one was from his own department, and he helped make it. He started working at Hadco in 1979 after high school. Then he worked at Sanders, R&D, and then at Teledyne. He was an apprentice to John Hardwick and Victor, I didn't get the last name, on rigid flex circuitry. And Bob has a patent for one of his inventions. And he's also called by his peers the keeper of tribal knowledge.
Oh, wow.
Because there's things he doesn't tell anyone that they've been inventing over all this time. There are literally layers of ingenuity in those circuit boards. Let's see, I have a circuit board that he told me was used in the F-22 Raptor aircraft, the world's first 5th generation aircraft. And I'll show that to you right now.
Wow. Was that Lockheed?
You know, I don't know who made the F-22 Raptor. I don't remember that. But you can see all the wiring. It's quite beautiful, really.
Yeah.
And then the book binding, he could tell I had cut away the book binding, and now maybe I shouldn't have. And he explained, you know, there's a copper layer, and he explained all the layering of the circuit board. And I recently went to YouTube to try and see the process, a handmade circuit board and a machine-made process as well with circuit boards. So it really is interesting. Let's see. Yes, so some boards in a quilt, he recognized, he went to my website and also looked very closely at the parts in my quilts. He said some of the circuit boards and parts I was using were used in a missile at the time that was a highly classified project at the time. So I was like, wow, they were just throwing that ingenuity in the trash. And
Wait not too long, here there.
yeah, these companies are not allowed to throw away parts anymore. They privately now dispose of their cast-off parts. So he wondered how I got this stuff, because at the time, you could have been in big trouble. Espionage. So the mass production of the computer parts that involved handmade work reminded me of the textile mill history. The more I learn, the more fascinated I get. Another woman engineer came to my studio named Denise, and she started at Cabletron, actually, when she was young, teenager probably, high school. Cabletron, let's see, Denise told me her work involved tedious handwork of placing wires and connecting wires in the circuit boards themselves. I know that soldering was also involved in making circuit boards. Many women were working at Cabletron. Denise, while working full-time, attended night classes offered by the company Digital back at that time. And so she took it her own initiative to keep learning and progress in the industry. She became an engineer and was the only woman of 30 engineers in her company, she said, after she had taken classes and furthered her skills. After Cabletron, she worked for Sanders and then Teledyne. She's known nationally for her work and ingenuity. She recognized circuit boards in my studio. She also told me that the microchips I have, They actually have 14 karat gold on the pins because it doesn't corrode. So she said, like, if we were making chips and circuit boards and everything else for like a submarine, they had to use that gold. And I'd always wondered about that gold. So now everybody's gonna want my microchips. But I'm tending now to want to keep all my junk. So anyway, okay. Yeah, so she's been part of those innovations since the 1990s herself. Let's see. So I call this talk Art Meets Industry. The people at the Courier, that whole story is pretty thrilling. And this Bob wrote me, he said he couldn't be more excited about having his work that is his whole life being up there in a museum piece, so he was really thrilled, and I am thrilled to have met them both and love the fact that I can incorporate parts like theirs into my artwork. So I'll quickly tell you that this was Bob's Raytheon part that he recognized because he said the number 470-1 is what gave it away. And then this was, he told me, a Honeywell part that was used in all in-flight information systems on the back of passenger seats on commercial airlines. Thousands of them were built. Probably more than thousands now, and I guess they trained a lot of people with this particular circuit board when they were first learning how to make circuit boards. And then this piece here, he was telling me, is for a fuel system for an airplane. So somehow this, and this shows you the bookbinding, the layers of this resin, the wires are in between the resin and fiberglass. And so they started with maybe 3 layers, and I forget how many layers they're up to now, maybe 16. But anyway, so all really interesting stuff happening here in New Hampshire, and now we don't know what the future is of the industry here, do we? Does anybody know what's happening next? So thanks for listening.
Does anyone have any questions for Anne?
Oh, yeah. Questions? No? Okay.
Well, you have a lot of history in your work, obviously. And so what really drew you into these particular formats of the work, of the art as you present it to us?
Well, you know what? In this show, I went for more technical aesthetic. Some of my other quilts look more fabric-like with the wire cloth, but these definitely have more of the technology influence for this show. This format is actually inspired by the microchip. I have here actually a microchip that's cracked open, and you can see how beautiful they are. They almost look like quilts, very aesthetically similar. So I kind of made this look like microchip, I came up with that kind of aesthetic. The piece over there is the Cabletron circuit boards. So I was able to salvage about 30 plus Cabletron set circuit boards. So I made a piece, that one is 28 instead of 30, but I kept them all together, and I really feel like it's a part of New Hampshire history. So I tended to make another microchip looking little squares inside of that piece, but keeping a lot of the circuit board visual. And then I used patina on copper as just a kind of beautiful element that you would see the old copper in architecture. And then I find out it's all part of the circuit board process, the copper and the chemicals. So I guess, does that answer your question? Just some of the...
it seems like you're the bridge between technology and art.
Yeah, well, that's a nice thing to say. Yeah.
So are the Cabletron circuit boards, are those plastic?
They are, so they must have the fiberglass